Snow pressed against the glass like a white hand trying to hush the world outside. Inside the small cabin, Helen Mae Dawson fed another log to the fire and watched sparks curl up the chimney like restless souls. She had grown used to the silence of winters, though it never stopped feeling heavy. Silence could be crueler than voices, for in it returned the echoes of all that was once said about her. Cursed, wild, unfit to marry, unfit to belong. Even the crackle of the fire seemed to whisper those words when the night deepened, and the wind screamed over the ridge. She was 28 now, beautiful in a way the town called dangerous. Her hair fell in loose waves, untamed, her eyes always too sharp for men who wanted softness. It had been years since she had lived with another soul, years since her mother's grave had vanished under the same drifts now piling against her door. Solitude had become her only company. Sometimes she believed she wore it like a shawl, and other times like chains. The snowstorm rose fierce by evening, blotting out even the black trees that clung to the valley. Helen set her lantern on the sill, more out of habit than hope. Few traveled this way in such weather. She wrapped herself in a faded quilt, settling near the fire. Her fingers, cracked from chopping wood and carrying water, ached. She wondered if spring would ever feel warm enough to reach her bones. Then came the sound. A thud at first, muffled by wind. She stiffened, the air in her chest locking. Another thud, heavier. The unmistakable rhythm of a hand against her door. No one knocked here. Travelers passed on toward town, or perished in the snow long before. Helen rose slowly, every step through her narrow cabin creaking with hesitation. Her hand touched the latch, cold against her skin, and she pulled the door open into a blizzard of white. Two figures stood there, monumental against the storm. The first was a man, young, broad-shouldered, tall as though the sky had shaped him differently from others. Snow streaked his dark hair and clung to the bare muscles of his chest, for his cloak hung open as though he cared little for the cold. His skin, copper and scar-marked, carried the proud bearing of an Apache warrior. Beside him leaned an older man, white-haired, his back bent yet his eyes sharp. He clutched a staff for balance, his breath ragged from the climb through snow. "Can we stay one night?" The younger man's voice was low, calm, carrying the weight of a request that was not begging. Helen's heart hammered. The warnings of town folk rang through her. Apaches bring only ruin. But the old man looked so tired he seemed nearly carved from ice, and the younger's eyes, dark, unblinking, were not cruel but patient, waiting for her judgment. For one breath she thought of shutting the door. For another, she thought of how empty the cabin had felt. She stepped aside. The younger man guided his father in first, brushing snow from his shoulders before laying him near the fire. Helen caught the faint smell of pine smoke clinging to their clothes, and beneath it, something wilder, earth and horse and storm. They did not thank her, not with words, but the silence they carried felt like respect, not entitlement. She knelt by the hearth, adding wood. The firelight threw gold across the young man's torso. Scars traced his skin like maps of battles endured, and his breath fogged the air though he did not shiver. Helen tried not to stare, tried not to remember how long it had been since she had seen another's strength up close. The old man, meanwhile, pressed his palms toward the flames, his thin fingers trembling. "You'll need blankets," Helen said, her voice cracking from disuse. She fetched what she had, patched quilts, smelling faintly of cedar, and laid them near the stranger's father. The old man's eyes met hers for a moment, and she felt something pass between them. Recognition, perhaps, of two people long acquainted with loneliness. As the storm deepened, the cabin filled with a new kind of silence. Not the hollow quiet of her solitude, but the hush of watchfulness. The young Apache sat cross-legged near the fire, sharpening a small knife with a stone. The steady rasp echoed through the room, strangely soothing. Helen busied herself with boiling water, slicing what roots and dried meat she had. She placed the pot over the fire, and the rising steam softened the air. "You've lived here long?" The words startled her. The young man spoke without looking up, his tone curious rather than probing. "Long enough," she answered, then fell silent, unsure if more should follow. He nodded, as though the brevity of her reply was enough. That small courtesy unsettled her. Men in town demanded stories, explanations, proofs. This one accepted what was given. The old man dozed beside the hearth, his breathing deepening, his lined face easing under warmth. Helen found herself studying him. The strength still hidden in his jaw, the dignity in his posture even when frail. She wondered if he had been feared once, as his son surely was now. Night stretched. The storm howled at the cabin walls, but inside, firelight held a fragile peace. Helen served them bowls of stew. The younger man ate slowly, offering half his portion back to his father without hesitation. That gesture pierced her in a way she could not name. She remembered how no one had shared with her when she starved after her family's loss, how even neighbors turned their backs. When the bowls were empty and the fire burned low, Helen spread another quilt over the old man's shoulders. Her fingers brushed his weathered hand, and his eyes opened just long enough to whisper a word she did not know. She thought it sounded like, "daughter." Later, when both men slept, Helen sat alone again in her chair by the window. Snow still roared outside, and the lantern still burned on the sill. But the silence had changed. It no longer pressed down like a stone. Instead it held a faint hum, the presence of other lives breathing near hers. She studied the younger man's face in sleep. The hard lines softened, his chest rising steady, and for the first time in years, she wondered if loneliness was not her only fate. The wind slammed against the cabin as though to remind her of danger, of the town's warnings, of how easily kindness could ruin a woman already judged. She pulled the quilt tighter, staring at the door, half expecting more knocks to come. And when the fire hissed suddenly, spitting sparks, she felt the truth settle in her chest like both dread and hope. Her world had shifted the moment she opened that door. She whispered into the quiet, as if confessing to the storm itself, "Nothing will be the same now." Morning came pale and brittle, the storm spent but leaving the world buried in silence. Snow lay deep against the cabin walls, glittering where the first light touched it. Helen Mae Dawson stirred from uneasy rest, finding the two strangers still within her home. White Feather slept by the hearth, his thin chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. The younger man, Nawel, she would later learn, was already awake, crouched at the door, mending a strap with deft fingers. He looked up only once, a glance quick as a hawk's, then returned to his task, as though her presence required no words. Helen stepped past him, opening the door to the hard brilliance of morning. The air cut her lungs sharp and clean. She knew she could not keep them hidden forever. Her cabin had always been a subject of curiosity for townsfolk, who whispered about her, as though she were some wild creature. If neighbors caught sight of Apaches within, the whispers would swell to storms fiercer than last night's blizzard. Yet something stronger than caution urged her to help the old man. She could not let him wither in her care without medicine, or food more substantial than what she had. That meant the town. By the time they reached the rutted path that led toward settlement, Helen's pulse had tightened into a hard knot. Nawel walked at her side, his father supported gently between them, and the sight of the three together felt strange even to her own eyes, like a painting from a world that should not exist. Snow squeaked beneath their boots, ravens watched from branches overhead, and every step carried the weight of inevitability. The town emerged from behind cottonwoods, its false fronts frosted white, smoke curling thinly from chimneys. Conversation stilled as soon as they set foot on the main street. Men straightened from their work, women clutched shawls closer, children paused mid-play. The hush was like the intake of a collective breath before judgment fell. Martha Kellum was first. Her mouth, always quick with rumor, twitched into a smile sharp as glass. "Well, well," she said loudly enough for all to hear. "Seems Helen Dawson's got herself company at last. A pity it took savages to keep her warm." The words cut deeper than the wind. Helen kept her chin high, but her throat burned. She had lived years with their scorn, but to see it turned toward the weary old man at her side felt unbearable. She tightened her grip on White Feather's arm, guiding him with more care, refusing to look Martha's way. Sheriff Harlan Pike strode from his office, boots crunching in the snow. His presence commanded the street like a drawn gun. He looked first at Helen, then at the two men beside her, his jaw setting hard. "What's this, Miss Dawson? You harboring strays?" His tone was not curious, it was warning. "They need medicine," Helen said, voice steady despite the trembling in her belly. That's all. Pike's eyes narrowed. Medicine leads to trouble when given to the wrong kind. You'd do well to remember that. Nawell did not speak. He did not so much as shift his weight. But when Pike stepped closer, his gaze lifted to meet the sheriff's. Dark, unwavering, it carried no threat yet held a quiet strength that unsettled more than raised voices ever could. Pike faltered, only a fraction, before he spat on the snow and turned away with a mutter. The onlookers, denied spectacle, busied themselves again, though their whispers tangled thick in the air. Inside the mercantile, the judgment grew heavier. Helen's request for dried meat and herbs was met with narrowed eyes, and a clattering of coins counted too loudly. She felt their stares prick her back, each glance accusing her of sins unspoken. She wanted to scream that compassion was not shame, that loneliness was not crime, but she kept silent, lifting White Feather's bundle with firm hands. On the way out, Martha's voice chased her. "Careful, Helen. Folks already think you're touched by curse. Taken wild men, and no decent soul will come near you again." Helen's steps faltered. For a moment the weight of years of rejection pressed so hard, she thought she might drop the bundle, and run into the snow until the cold swallowed her. Then she felt Nawell's hand. He had not touched her, not truly, but his shadow fell across hers, and when she glanced sideways, his eyes were steady, unreadable yet anchoring. She lifted her chin once more and walked on. Back at the cabin, she stoked the fire while White Feather rested. Nawell took the woodpile in silence, splitting logs with swift, controlled strikes. The rhythm of the axe against grain echoed like a heartbeat through the crisp air. Helen watched from the doorway, torn between gratitude and unease. Each act of quiet labor unsettled her more than words would have, for it suggested he intended to remain until his father was strong again. As dusk fell, Helen spooned broth into White Feather's cup, lifting it gently to his lips. He sipped, whispered something in his own tongue, and let his head rest against the chair. For the first time in many winters, Helen felt the cabin full, of breath, of presence, of something alive besides herself. Yet unease coiled beneath it, for the town's judgment had already begun its work. When Nawell set down the axe and stepped back into the cabin, sweat dampening his chest despite the cold, he paused at the sight of her tending his father. Their eyes met, hers wary, his unreadable, and for a moment, silence bloomed between them like a fragile truce. It said more than thanks, more than apology, though neither gave it name. Night deepened. The wind had calmed, but Helen's thoughts churned. She lay awake long after the men had settled, listening to White Feather's breathing, and the faint hiss of embers. She remembered Pike's warning, Martha's taunt, the tightening of eyes around every corner. She had been judged before, but never with another's life tied to her choices. This time, the whispers would not fall solely upon her. They would strike the strangers she had led across her threshold. Turning toward the darkened shape of Nawell resting near the fire, she felt the weight of decision press down. To send them away would mean safety, perhaps, but to keep them was to invite the storm of human cruelty upon them all. Her chest ached with the knowledge that neither path left her unscathed. She closed her eyes, whispering into the stillness words she barely dared form. "What have I done?" And in that hush, with only the sound of another's steady breath breaking her solitude, she knew that the world outside was already sharpening its knives for her. Snow lingered heavy in the days that followed, the valley smothered beneath white silence. The cabin became a world of its own, 3 souls sharing breath and warmth while the town's whispers gnawed unseen. Helen May Dawson tended the fire more carefully now, aware that 2 lives leaned upon its light. She told herself it was duty alone that kept her hands busy, yet each gesture carried more weight than she would admit. White Feather weakened further, his cough rattling like brittle branches in wind. Yet in rare moments, his voice carried a soft strength that drew Helen nearer. One evening, when Nawell had gone to split wood, the old man beckoned her closer. His words came haltingly, stitched with breaths, but they shaped a story Helen felt in her bones. They had once lived in the southern hills, proud among their people, until enemies and hunger drove them north. Age had slowed him, and with it came exile. Some saw him as burden, others as relic. Only his son had stayed. Helen listened, heart tight. Exile was a word she knew without wearing its name. She, too, had been left behind, not by choice but by cruelty, and the town that should have been hers had marked her as cursed instead. She asked no questions, but the old man's gaze seemed to read her silence, as if her life were written plainly across her face. "Alone too long," he murmured, before drifting again into sleep. Nawel returned with the scent of pine on his skin, snow melting against his bare arms. He laid near the hearth without glance or word, but Helen felt the unspoken thread weaving between them grow tauter. Each act of labor, each quiet offering, seemed not duty but something more, though she could not yet name it without fear. She busied herself with bread, though her fingers shook when she passed him a slice. Their hands brushed, and both drew back quickly, as though the fire had burned them. In the long nights, Helen's memories stirred. She would lie awake, watching shadows shift over the cabin beams, and recall the night flames had devoured her childhood home. Neighbors had gathered with water buckets, but too late. Whispers rose from the ashes, that her family carried God's displeasure, that Helen herself bore the mark. When suitors avoided her, when friends turned cold, she had swallowed her shame until it hardened into silence. Now, with strangers under her roof, the shame returned sharp, but mingled with something unexpected, defiance. One afternoon, as she drew water from the frozen creek, Nawel appeared at her side. His presence was quiet but commanding, his steps leaving clean prints in snow. Without asking, he lifted the heavy pail, carrying it back up the slope as though it weighed nothing. Helen's throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, but words felt small. Instead she watched the way the winter sun glinted on his hair, the ease with which he moved, the steady strength that did not boast. It was then she understood why the town feared men like him, because their dignity did not bow. Yet fear was not confined to town. It reached her door in the form of Sheriff Pike. He rode out late in the day, horse steaming, rifle resting easy across his lap. He dismounted without greeting, his boots sinking into the snow outside her cabin. Helen stepped out to meet him, heart thudding hard enough she thought it might betray her. "You're making a mistake," Pike said flatly, his gaze sliding toward the smoke curling from her chimney. "People are talking. A woman alone, keeping company with men who don't belong. It don't sit right. Won't sit right with the council either." "They're no threat," Helen answered, though her voice trembled. "That's not what matters." His eyes narrowed. "What matters is appearance. You're already half an outcast, Helen May. Don't give folks reason to take the rest from you." The words struck harder than any blow. She wanted to cry out that she had nothing left for them to take, that they had already stripped her of belonging years ago, but pride held her tongue. Pike waited, searching her face, then shook his head with something like pity. "Send them on before trouble finds you." When he rode away, the silence left behind felt heavier than before. Helen turned, finding Nawel standing in the doorway, shadows falling across his face. He had heard enough, perhaps all of it, but spoke nothing. His eyes, steady and dark, carried neither shame nor plea, only an unflinching acceptance that pierced her more than words could. She looked away first, ashamed not of him, but of the fear knotting inside her. That night, White Feather stirred again, his eyes gleaming faintly in firelight. "Storm outside," he whispered, voice rasping but clear. "Storm inside too." Helen sat beside him, her hand brushing his as she adjusted the blanket. He smiled, faint but knowing, as though he had seen storms like this before. Storms not of weather but of human hearts. Later, when the old man slept, Helen rose to find Nawel standing at the window, watching snow drift against the glass. His shoulders rose and fell slowly, his silence deep but not empty. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell him of Pike's warning, of her fear of losing the only ground she had left, but the words stayed lodged. Instead, she joined him, standing close enough that their breaths mingled on the glass. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire cracked behind them, the snow whispered outside, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Helen's chest ached with the weight of choice. Sending them away would appease the town, but leave her cabin hollow again. Keeping them meant inviting scorn, perhaps ruin. Yet as she stood beside Nawel, their reflections blurred together in the frost, she felt the balance shift. Loneliness had been a slow death. Perhaps judgment was a lesser wound than silence everlasting. She turned to him, lips parting as though to speak, but he looked back with eyes unreadable, and the moment broke. She retreated to the hearth, her heart pounding too loud for sleep. Still, the seed of decision had taken root, though she dared not name it. When dawn came pale and cold, Helen found herself kneeling once more by Whitefeather's side. His breath was weaker now, his skin lined deep with shadows. He opened his eyes just enough to fix her with a gaze sharp despite age. His voice, fragile yet firm, whispered a word she finally understood. "Daughter." The sound of it struck her like a bell. She froze, hand trembling against his. Across the room, Nawel stirred from sleep, his dark eyes meeting hers with something unspoken, recognition, or perhaps a question. And in that fragile hush, Helen realized she had already crossed the line the town had drawn for her. The storm did not relent, it only shifted its voice. By day, the snow fell quiet as feathers, but by night, wind scraped against the cabin walls like knives. Inside, Helen felt the walls of her world closing tighter. Whitefeather's breathing grew shallow, and each time she laid a hand against his brow, she wondered if dawn would still find him. Nawel worked with tireless patience, splitting wood, fetching water, patching gaps in the roof. His strength filled every corner of the cabin, yet it also drew the weight of eyes beyond these hills. Helen sensed the change first in the way ravens scattered before the sound of hooves. On the third day since Pike's warning, riders appeared on the ridge. Shadows against the snow, rifles glinting faintly. Town men, hardened by gossip, spurred not by truth but by fear. Helen's throat tightened as she watched them descend toward her cabin. She knew the shape of judgment when it came mounted and armed. Nawel saw them too. He set down the axe, wiped frost from his brow, and turned to meet her gaze. There was no surprise in his eyes, only the calm of one who had lived with suspicion his whole life. "They come," he said softly, the first words he had spoken in hours. Helen swallowed hard. "They'll want you gone." He nodded once, not as surrender but as fact. His father coughed weakly behind them, the sound brittle as thin glass. Helen wanted to weep at the cruelty of it, the timing, the blindness of men who came ready to condemn even a dying elder. But tears would only weaken her. She pressed her palms together, steadying herself, and stepped outside as the riders drew close. The snow crunched loud under their horses. Sheriff Pike led them, his rifle slung across his chest, his face hard as frozen earth. Behind him came three others, Martha's brother among them, his mouth already twisted with scorn. They halted a dozen paces away, steam rising from their horses' nostrils like smoke from anger not yet loosed. "Helen May," Pike called, voice carrying over the snow. "You were warned. Now here we are." She forced her chin high. "They've done no harm. The old man is ill. They only needed shelter." "Shelter becomes harbor," Pike shot back. "And harbor becomes threat. Folks won't stand for it." Her heart pounded. She wanted to argue, to tell them loneliness had been her only crime until now, but words caught like splinters in her throat. Nawel stepped forward then, shirtless despite the cold, his breath rising steady in the air. He placed himself between Helen and the rifles without flourish, only a stillness that felt larger than defiance. Martha's brother spat into the snow. "Look at him, bold as a wolf at your door. Don't tell me he ain't danger." But Nawel neither moved nor spoke. His silence unsettled them more than shouting would have. Pike's grip on his rifle tightened. Helen's breath fogged fast, her body trembling with the knowledge that one spark of violence would turn this snow into a grave. Whitefeather's voice broke through from inside, cracked yet carrying weight. "Leave him." The old man coughed, but the sound of his words seemed to ripple across the riders like the echo of something ancient. Pike frowned, unsettled, yet pride held him stiff. Helen stepped forward then, boots sinking into the drift. "If you'll brand me again, do it. Say I'm cursed, say I'm ruined. But don't lay that blame on them. All they've shown me is kindness." Her voice shook, but she forced each syllable into the cold like nails driven deep. Martha's brother sneered. "Kindness? Is that what you call it? A woman alone keeping savages in her home?" The word burned through her like hot iron. She nearly faltered, but Nawel turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. Something passed in his gaze. Not plea, not command, but a steadying strength. It anchored her. She drew breath again. "They will stay until the old man is well enough to leave," she said firmly. "And if the town can't stomach that, then the town can choke on its own judgment." The riders shifted uneasily. This was not the Helen May they had known. The silent woman bowed under whispers. Pike's jaw hardened, but doubt flickered in his eyes. He was not a man eager to spill blood on a woman's doorstep, not with witnesses who might call it cruelty rather than justice. Yet pride warred with caution, and his rifle remained ready. The standoff stretched, snow falling soft around them, silence broken only by the horses' restless snorts. Helen's breath stung her lungs, her hands clenched tight in her skirts. She felt the world narrowing to this moment, this fragile balance where one shout could unravel everything. Inside, White Feather coughed again, and the sound seemed to pierce even the hardest of hearts. One of the riders muttered, uneasy, "He's old, Harlan. Ain't no warrior left in him." Pike's glare silenced the man, but doubt grew like cracks in ice. Still, his pride demanded control. "You're choosing ruin, Helen May," he said coldly. "Don't say I didn't warn you when no place in this valley will take you back." She stood straighter, though her knees quaked. "I never asked them to." The words left her lips before she could swallow them, and they rang sharp in the frozen air. For the first time in years, she had spoken not in apology but in defiance. The echo of it startled her as much as it startled them. Pike's expression darkened, yet he did not raise his rifle. Instead he pulled his reins sharply, turning his horse with a snap. The others hesitated, then followed, muttering into the wind. Their shapes blurred into the falling snow until only silence remained. Helen stood trembling in the drift, the cold biting through her thin dress. Nawell remained by her side, unmoved, as though carved from the same stone that weathered mountains. She dared not look at him too long, afraid of what her eyes might confess. Instead she turned back toward the cabin, breath ragged, heart hammering. Inside, the fire had burned low. White Feather's eyes glimmered faintly as she laid another log, his lips curling into a weak smile. "Storm passes," he whispered. Helen swallowed hard, though the storm in her chest still raged. She glanced once more at Nawell, who stood by the window, watching the last trace of riders vanish into the storm. His jaw was set, his shoulders steady, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, something waiting, unresolved. And Helen, though shaken, felt the truth press upon her with unbearable weight. The storm outside had only retreated. The real one was still coming, and it would demand from her a choice she could no longer delay. The days that followed were like glass stretched thin, every sound in the valley carrying the threat of shattering. Helen felt it in the way the snow cracked beneath her boots, in the way ravens circled overhead as if waiting for carrion. The riders had left, but their judgment lingered, a shadow that pressed against the cabin walls. Each time Helen stepped outside to fetch wood or water, she felt the weight of unseen eyes. It was no longer the storm she feared, but the men who had vowed to break her resolve. White Feather's strength waned, his breath a shallow flutter in the night. Helen sat by his side, bathing his forehead, whispering words she barely remembered from childhood prayers. He would grasp her hand in the dark, his grip frail yet insistent, as if reminding her that his son's fate, and perhaps her own, was bound to what choices she made now. Nawell never left his father's side for long, but when he stepped out into the snow, shirtless beneath the sky, he seemed like a figure carved from winter itself, both guardian and exile. Helen could not look upon him without a swell of emotions she fought to contain: gratitude, fear, and something perilously close to longing. The breaking point came on a dawn brittle with ice. Helen rose to find the cabin surrounded. Pike had returned, this time with more men, their rifles gleaming cold in the early light. Horses pawed at the snow, steam curling from their nostrils. The air tasted of iron, of decision already forged. Helen's pulse hammered as she opened the door, stepping out into the pale light. The men tightened their circle. "This ends now," Pike declared. His voice was steady, but the frost of pride clung to every word. "The town won't tolerate lawlessness. You had your warning. The Apache leaves, alive or dead." Nawell stepped out before Helen could speak. The breath of the morning rose from his chest in plumes. He wore no weapon, only the quiet strength of his presence. He moved to stand in the snow, between rifles and the cabin, his eyes fixed not in challenge, but in refusal to yield. Helen's breath caught at the sight. A man prepared to face ruin not with violence but with dignity unbending. "You'll have to go through me first," Helen said suddenly, her voice ringing sharper than she had ever heard it. She moved to stand beside Noel, skirts dragging in the drift, chin lifted though her knees quivered. The men shifted uneasily, muttering, their rifles wavering. They had expected fear, not defiance. Pike's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing at the woman who refused to bow. "Think carefully," he warned. "Your name is already ash. Defy us here, and there'll be nothing left for you." "I've lived with nothing for years," Helen answered, her breath steaming in the cold. "But I'll not live with shame for turning away the only kindness this cabin has known." The words hung in the air like a struck bell. Noel's eyes flicked toward her, and for the briefest moment, she saw a crack in his calm, something raw, humbled, as though her defiance had reached deeper than any act of mercy. Pike raised his rifle, pride cornered. The world narrowed to the point of its barrel, to the hush that gripped even the wind. Helen felt her body shake, yet she did not step back. Beside her, Noel lowered himself to his knees in the snow, his father's dignity echoing through the act. He spread his hands wide, offering no threat, only the truth of restraint. The sight unsettled the riders more than any show of force could have. One muttered, "This ain't right, Harlan." Another shifted in his saddle, gaze falling away. The rifles wavered, not from fear but from shame. For what man could justify spilling blood against one who would not fight? Pike's face darkened, his pride bleeding into rage. He held the rifle steady, but Helen stepped forward, placing herself squarely between the barrel and Noel's chest. Her voice rang fierce, trembling yet resolute. "If you fire, you'll fire through me." Time slowed. The cold bit her skin, her breath shallow in her chest. She thought of the years of silence, the years of shame, and felt them burning away in this single act. She was no longer the woman bowed by whispers. She was a woman who chose, and her choice stood tall before them all. The moment stretched until even Pike's resolve cracked. His rifle lowered by a fraction, then more, until it hung at his side. His eyes, though still hard, betrayed defeat. "You've made your bed, Helen May," he spat. "May it bury you." With a sharp pull of his reins, he turned his horse. The others followed, their mutters lost to the crunch of hooves and the sweep of snow. When the last shape vanished over the ridge, Helen's knees weakened. She staggered, but Noel caught her arm, steadying her. His touch was firm, warm against the bite of winter. For a long moment they stood in the quiet aftermath, breath mingling in the icy air. No words passed, but something deeper than speech bound them. Inside, white feathers stirred faintly. Helen knelt beside him, her hand finding his. His eyes opened, pale and fading, yet filled with peace. He looked upon her with a faint smile, whispering with his final strength, "Daughter of Snowlight." His breath left him like a sigh carried into the storm, and silence filled the cabin. Noel bowed his head, tears striking the old man's blanket. Helen rested her hand atop his, sharing the weight of loss. They sat in stillness until the fire crackled again, reminding them the world still turned. Days later, when Helen walked into town with Noel beside her, whispers still followed. Martha's eyes narrowed, Pike's stare lingered like frost. Yet Helen's head did not bow. She walked with dignity restored, her steps steady, her arm brushing against the man who had chosen restraint over rage, and who now chose to walk beside her. The valley stretched wide and white around them, no less cruel, but no longer empty. Helen felt the ache of grief, the pulse of fear, and beneath it, the fragile spark of hope that had survived storms harsher than snow. She carried it with her, as precious as fire in winter. And in the quiet of her heart, she heard the old soul's whisper. Sometimes love is not shouted into being, but grown in the silence between two who choose to stand against the storm together.